Disclaimer, this video is not supposed to make fun of Rene Kink. I don't want to be involved in any kink shaming. Ha ha ha. It's not uncommon for players to have lost multiple grand finals. When you're on a good team for a while, you get multiple chances at success, and you won't win all of them. Today's Sydney team, for example, has 4 players who've lost 3 or more matches on the last Saturday of September. There's been a few who failed to win 4. Zach Dawson springs to mind immediately for me, and for Ross Lyon too, probably. There's been an unlucky few who've gone 0 for 5. They all happen to be teammates with the unluckiest man of all, a man who joined a club of only 79 men who've played 6 grand finals. He's the only one of those to have never won a flag.
To think that I've come from Ararat, the wilderness, plucked out of nowhere, come down and play football, and here I am. It's sort of unheard of.
Football came easy to Rene Kink. He tore up his local league in Ararat, scoring 10 goals a game in the under-16s, including a monster bag of 22 goals 15. Collingwood liked what they saw and picked him up, giving him his first taste of the VFL at 16 years, 295 days old. He scored 5 goals across 4 games, but only got kicks in half of them, coming on as a late 20th substitute in the other 2. The last of those 4 games happened to be the preliminary final, an inclusion for, of all people, a dropped Peter McKenna. Not only was he the youngest player in VFL finals history, he soon became its youngest goal scorer, and he tacked on 2 more for good measure, but the Pies failed to progress. After struggling to make the side in 1974, the 18-year-old Kink burst into another finals-bound Magpies side in 75. The kid racked up good numbers, but he missed Collingwood's sole final that season. 76 saw the dreaded wooden spoon make its first visit to Collingwood, and was another developmental year for Kink, which he seemed quite comfortable with. 1977, though, was the year it all started to come into place. There's one main thing you needed to know about Kink. He was big. You don't get called the IncRENEble Hulk if you're not. At 183 centimetres and 92 kilograms at his peak, he was a battleship-class bruiser-cruiser with enough pace to skip away from bigger defenders. His method of play defied physics, built like a linebacker, but agile as a gazelle. Under the management of new coach Tom Hafey, both Collingwood and Kink hit new heights. From last in 76, they soared all the way to the 1977 grand final, and at three-quarter time they were home, 5 goals up in a low-scoring game against an inaccurate opponent. Where have I heard this one before? Yeah, that's right, an ineffectual star got moved and some lesser lights got rid of that big gap. Twiggy Dunn scored a late equaliser to take the match to next week, and Kink responded in the traditional Collingwood fashion. Malcolm Blight decided to actually turn up in the replay, and so despite a legendary Phil Manasseh solo run, the Roos got up in large part due to their better preparation, something which the Magpies would learn from over 30 years later. Sorry, Saints fans. 1978 was pretty good for Kink, playing every game bar the prelim final, which, again, the Pies lost to North. But Kink was ready to come back bigger and stronger in 1979. 400 disposals, 50 goals. Only Ken Sheldon would be able to match that, but he couldn't get near Kink's top 10 in the Brownlow medal. Even in 2022, only 2 guys were able to hit those sorts of numbers. And almost as if it was destiny, Kink and Sheldon would go head-to-head to decide the 1979 premiership. Carlton were favourites, but Collingwood had beaten them in round 21 by the biggest margin Carlton had lost by all year. And on a wet and miserable day, Collingwood got first blood, both in scoring and in body count. Both times it was Rene Kink. He smashed into Michael Young, starting a small melee and getting himself reported. This set the tone for a hard-fought slugfest, full of thuggery. People call this a classic, they're lying. It was an ugly affair. Carlton wasted chances early, their first 6 shots going wide of the target, with Collingwood gaining a 21-point lead thanks to their superior accuracy. Then, Russell Olsen gets smashed by Trevor Keogh with an awful flying elbow which would earn Keogh a 2-month-long ban. Sure, Collingwood score off the free kick to go up by 28, but Olsen had been involved in everything so far, including this goal assisted by guess who? Harms splits an undermanned midfield straight afterwards but misses. This, though, marked the beginning of a Carlton run of dominance. Harms has another chance and converts, marking the start of a run of 6 consecutive Blues goals. Davis scores 1 to break the run, but Carlton score 4 of the next 5 to go into three-quarter time with a 21-point lead. Collingwood needs a hero to stabilise them. Billy Picken takes a screamer, with Davis getting his 4th goal to start a flurry of Collingwood scoring. And up steps Rene Kink. He'd been well covered by a bloke whose name sounded like a Batman punch sound effect, but he gathers it from about 50,000 metres out and drills a long one home, reducing the margin to 4. Collingwood were closing, Carlton were nervous, but then it happened. I've talked before about bullshit pieces of play that decide the winner before the game comes close to ending, a preemptive sign of the footy gods stapling colours to the mast. This is the biggest one yet. Wayne Harms kicks an up and under grubber. He sprints after it in the muggy conditions. It takes the weirdest bounce. Well, maybe the second weirdest. Sorry again, Saints fans. It holds up for an age, an eternity. And then, the microsecond before it goes out of play, he dives, full stretch, and bashes that ball with nothing but hopes and prayers. And look who's there on the end of it. Shit, luck, and chance in the form of Ken Sheldon, the other guy to have got 450. He ends it. Collingwood will lose by 5 points. Kink returns in 1980 after a 4-week suspension, and his season was pretty respectable. 300 touches and 40 goals is nothing to sneeze at. Collingwood again played well, and just like that, it's grand final time again. Unfortunately, well, let's just look at the end score. Even if Collingwood had taken their chances, Richmond just had more. Despite beating the top 2 sides in finals, Richmond just proved to be way too much for the Pies right from the start. A loss in a replay, a loss by a goal, and then a thrashing. Surely, it can't get worse than that. 1981. Kink has recovered from missing a large chunk of the year with injury and has played himself into form. He doesn't look the same as he did in 1979 and 80, but he can still break teams apart on his day. And that Collingwood side is still strong. Strong enough to once again be within 1 point of Carlton at halftime of a grand final. They took it to another level in the third, and then it happened. I've talked before about bullshit pieces of play that decide the winner before the game comes close to ending, and here we go again. Mark Williams, future deathly rival of Alan Scott, smothers a kick and finishes his fine work. Enter Rene Kink. He hulks out, bashes loose what was a sure Carlton mark, puts an overhead hand pass to Ricky Barham, and bang. Collingwood were 21 up, within spitting distance of three-quarter time. Carlton had scored 6 goals in 70 minutes. Surely, this time, the Pies had it won. Well, Carlton scored 2 in a couple minutes right before the bell. It gave Carlton belief, and then one of the Pies board members decided he was a better motivator than Tommy freaking Hafey and unloads into Ricky Barham, who, if you'll remember, scored a goal about 5 minutes ago. He then started screaming at others, and it broke Collingwood's focus. Remember how in 1993 Adelaide's 42-point lead got broken up by a fart? Well, if that happened to professionals in the 1990s, what chance does a 9-point lead held by a bunch of guys who work 2 jobs have? Sheldon, Ashman, McClure, Mackay. There were only 4 goals scored in that final term. Those were the guys who scored them. With each goal, the feeling of each of the failed attempts before them overwhelmed Collingwood mentally, and the fast-running Mosquito fleet overwhelmed them physically. Just like in 1979, Carlton had pegged 6 consecutive goals onto an overconfident Collingwood side that had a 20-point lead. Only this time, it was the end. It severed the relationship between Hafey and his team. Collingwood imploded. They went from 17 wins to 4 in 1982. And Rene Kink didn't fare too much better. There's another thing you need to know about Rene Kink. Football was just something he did. It wasn't important to him. He did it because he was good at it, and he always was. As he said, the talent just came to him. He didn't have to work for it. And because he didn't work for it, the passion just kind of wasn't there. If his side looked at home in the final change, well, let's punch out early. Yeah, guessing that attitude sure came in handy in a couple of games that spring to mind. So training, yeah, that wasn't really his bag either. Of course, his coach was Tommy Hafey, who was fitter at 82 than most men at 22, and expected the same of his players. Kink and a few other senior players wanted the style of training to change, and it did when Hafey was sacked. Although the players, including Kink, voted him out, it wasn't really the change they wanted. There was a few issues between players and the board, as we've seen. A lot of players left, including captain Peter Moore, to a terrible Melbourne side, and the mood was low. Kink didn't really want to be there anymore, and it showed. So much so that the club he'd been with since he was a teenager sacked him. Any other man would have been angry. Not Kink, though. After all, football just wasn't that important. He was content to just go back to his job as a women's hairdresser. Yes, that's true, that's his salon behind him. He then had a brief flirtation with Hawthorn, but ended up signing with Essendon for the rest of 1983. What a choice. I'd love to know if Rene Kink had any regrets about how things played out. I wonder if he knew that the Hawks were going to turn into, in terms of Pythagorean expected wins at least, the greatest dynasty of the modern era. And I wonder if he knew how good the Bombers were about to get. After all, Kink's 1983 comeback tour went pretty damn well. 24 goals in 9 games, including a goal in the grand final, somehow only his 5th goal in 6 grand finals. 1983 was a heartbreak, sure, but grand finals in the 1980s seemed to tell interweaving stories like no other decade. And in 1984, the grand stage of the MCG offered Kink and his Bombers a chance at redemption. Three-quarter time, Hawthorn have kept the Dons at arm's length all day, but the Bombers changed things during the third. Kevin Sheedy, as he would become famous for, switched things up, rotating players freely between offense and defense. Madden was rested, and he had a mammoth final term when he came back on. Much as the Pies had done in 81, a bit of back chat and dissent in the Hawks huddle proved to be their downfall. Essendon scored 9 goals in the final term after scoring 5 over the first 3. They finally made their chances count, and they won the 1984 Premiership. There was only one problem for Rene Kink. He wasn't there. He'd suffered a severe knee injury in the pre-season and missed the whole of 1984. It was too cruel. He came back in 1985 and he wasn't really the same. He had some good games and some shockers and was dropped 3 times. The last time, after round 19, was the one he didn't come back from. He was named on an extended bench a few times, notably in the semi-final, but when Essendon tore Hawthorn apart on grand final day that year, again, Kink wasn't a part of it. According to Kink, the Essendon brass had come to him before the finals, and for reasons Kink still hasn't found an answer to, told him his services were no longer required. Kink had never felt truly at home at the Bombers as he had at the Magpies, and he wasn't exactly Kevin Sheedy's favourite type of player. In fact, Kink still hasn't forgiven Sheedy for what went down. At the age of 28, he was ready to retire, but one club still thought Kink had something to give. And we've talked about them before. A lot. St Kilda had long since passed sinking ship status and was now covered with barnacles astride the ocean floor, merrily rusting away. Not exactly the perfect environment for a bloke who didn't even really like footy in the first place, and a place that definitely ruled out the chance of Grand Final number 7. Kink was brought in to do some strength training with the Saints, and I can only imagine what boxing matches between Kink and Lockett would have looked like. The Saints got 2 wins, one of which was the 5th of 7 games for Kink that year. The facilities were dreadful, the team was nearly beyond help, and that was it for Rene Kink. He retired at age 29 and was content to do so. After all, football wasn't that important. He had played in 6 grand finals and failed to win all of them. Only Jack Titus failed to win as many, but he had 2 premiership medallions. Not only that, but he's the only man to be on the losing side of 2 different record grand final losses, let alone losses of 10 goals or more. And if all that weren't bad enough, he was on the list for a premiership winner twice in a row, but failed to make the field both times. It was kind of his fault though. Not so much the 80-point losses, but his performance in them. He was a man confident of his own ability, in fact, overly so, and it's hard not to be when you're scoring 22 goals in a game at age 16. But at VFL level, he was far too sporadic. His attitude to training showed how little he seemed to enjoy footy at a professional level, particularly under Hafey's exceptionally high standards, and was potentially a reason why he missed the triumphs for the Bombers. The grand final losses wore him down, and his performance was affected. In every one he played in, he seemed to get worse and worse. And that's why this guy is so important. Paul Weston. This poor bastard debuted for Glenelg in 1973 and missed their premiership that year. He then went on to play losing grand finals in 1974, 1975 and 1977. And 1981. And 1982. He would move to Victoria in 1983, and look where he wound up. Yeah, the only 2 men I could find to lose 6 senior grand finals in a row lost that 6th as teammates. The difference? Well, Weston wasn't as talented. He had to earn it, work for his opportunities, and he loved that work, so much so he became Glenelg's captain. He was Kevin Sheedy's type of player, and that's why he was here and Kink wasn't.
For Weston, he's put it through for a goal. What a match winner this guy's been at centre half.
It's at this point you might be feeling sad or sorry for Rene Kink. I certainly was. Kink, well, he was pretty angry at this point. And when Collingwood did this, a 33-year-old Kink who wouldn't have even been the oldest man in that 1990 premiership side, who was teammates with a few of those guys on that days, cried his eyes out. But those tears weren't just for his misfortune. They were also for the misfortune of the guys he played with, and for joy, seeing his beloved Collingwood finally lift that cup. But now, with the passing of time, Rene Kink can see his career for what it really was. A part of history. And he's proud of that. Proud of representing his Magpies. Yeah, sure, he would have loved the medal, loved for things to be different, but they were never going to be. They were never destined to be. After all, football just wasn't that important. Kink has no regrets about coming up empty a half dozen times. All that matters to him, really, and what should matter overall, is that he was a damn good player in his own right, fondly remembered by the Magpies faithful. In fact, he was IncRENEble.